The history of maritime discoveries, as we know it from school textbooks, has a clear vector, from west to east. We are accustomed to a picture of the world where small but courageous Portuguese and Spanish caravels, led by Vasco da Gama and Columbus, break out of their European cradle to connect the separated continents. In this narrative, Europe is an active explorer, while Asia and Africa are passive objects of discovery. However, at the beginning of the 15th century, several decades before Columbus was born, there was a force on the other side of the globe capable of turning this table upside down. The Ming Empire had a fleet that was dozens of times larger than anything Europe could muster at the time, in terms of scale, technology, and numbers. Admiral Zheng He's treasure ships were floating cities, and his squadrons numbered hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of people. In our reality, these expeditions suddenly came to an end in 1433. China burned its ships, destroyed its blueprints, and closed itself off from the world, leaving the oceans to the Europeans. This decision, dictated by internal politics and threats from the north, became one of the most fateful turns in human history. It gave Europe a 500-year head start. But history does not tolerate predetermination. Decisions are made by people, and people tend to change their minds under pressure from circumstances. What if the pragmatists at the emperor's court had prevailed? What if, instead of isolating itself, China had decided to expand its sphere of influence beyond the Indian Ocean? This is a scenario in which the great geographical discoveries take place in reverse. It is a world where it is not Columbus' 3 ships that approach the shores of America, but a giant armada from the Celestial Empire that drops anchor at the mouth of the Tagus River in Lisbon. Watch the video to the end to find out how the history of Zheng He's expeditions could have changed. To understand the scale of the changes, we need to look at the starting point. Between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch in the service of Emperor Yongle, made 7 grand voyages. These were not exploratory missions in the European sense. China was not seeking new lands. It knew it was the center of the world. These were diplomatic and commercial demonstrations of power. Zheng He's fleet visited Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. They brought ambassadors, exotic animals, including giraffes, and precious stones to Nanjing, establishing a system of vassalage and tribute. Their technical superiority was overwhelming. The fleet's flagships, the Baokuan, ranged in length from 60 to 120 meters, according to various estimates. By comparison, Columbus's Santa Maria was only about 20 meters long. Chinese ships had watertight bulkheads, multi-tiered decks on which fresh vegetables, soybean sprouts, were grown to combat scurvy and powerful artillery. However, in the 1430s, the political winds in Beijing changed. The conservative faction of Confucian officials considered sea voyages to be wasteful. The threat from the Mongols on the northern borders required enormous resources to strengthen the Great Wall and the army. As a result, after Zheng He's death, the expeditions were curtailed, the shipyards abandoned, and the documentation destroyed. China voluntarily withdrew from the sea. Let's imagine for a moment that the decision-making process in the Forbidden City had taken a different path, and events had taken a sharp turn. The year is 1435. Emperor Zhengtong ascends the throne, a boy who, in our story, was only 8 years old and did not rule on his own. In reality, power passed into the hands of conservative regents who were opposed to maritime expeditions and supporters of a closed country. But let's assume that in this alternative timeline, it is not the land-based military bureaucracy that has a key influence on the young ruler, but an influential faction of eunuchs. These people were closely connected with maritime trade in the port cities of the south, and they understood perfectly well that it was the sea that brought wealth. They put forward a compelling argument that is difficult to reject. The treasury is empty, and without decisive action, famine and uprisings lie ahead. Endless wars with the Mongols, the construction of defensive fortifications, and luxurious palaces have depleted the empire's financial resources to almost nothing. The closure of maritime trade, which the conservatives sought, would mean the loss of huge revenues from duties, foreign tribute, and intermediation in Indian and Arab trade. Instead of dismantling the fleet, the council makes an unexpected decision: to turn it into a source of wealth capable of replenishing the treasury. They decided that the sea could offer more than land campaigns. The empire should not only demonstrate its greatness, but also earn money. A new decree is issued, turning the fate of the expeditions in a completely different direction. Now voyages must not only symbolize the power of the Celestial Empire, but also bring back pure silver, gold, and high-value goods. Admirals are tasked with finding the direct sources of wealth that Arab and Indian merchants have been talking about for decades. These are mysterious lands far to the west, beyond a vast expanse of water that the Chinese called the Sea of Darkness. The council believed that this was where the key to the empire's financial salvation lay. Thus, for the first time, a goal appeared that lay beyond the traditional routes. The 8th expedition, launched in 1438, became the last gasp of great voyages in our history. But here everything is different. Now it is not the swan song of the fleet, but the beginning of a new era of maritime exploration and bold discoveries. The new Admiral, Zheng He's successor, receives an order of unprecedented audacity, not to return to China until the edge of the earth or an equal trading partner capable of ensuring a mutually beneficial exchange is found. A fleet of 200 ships leaves the port of Lujiagang, carrying not only goods but also the hopes of a great power. In Malindi, on the east coast of Africa, they do not turn back as they had done before. Instead, they catch the fast current of Agulhas off the coast of South Africa and boldly continue south to where a completely unknown world begins. The sea crossing around Africa is an extremely difficult task. The currents at the Cape of Good Hope are treacherous, and storms can scatter any squadron. However, Chinese Baokuan ships are incredibly stable thanks to their wide hulls and adjustable keels. After losing a dozen ships in storms, the fleet still managed to round the southern tip of Africa half a century before the Portuguese Bartolomeu Dias. Upon entering the Atlantic, the Chinese entered the Bengala Current, which pushed them northward along the western coast of the continent. This is where the first stage of culture shock began. The Chinese encountered the Kingdom of Congo and the states of West Africa. For local rulers, the arrival of giant floating palaces, armed with roaring pipes, cannons, was an event of divine proportions. Chinese diplomacy works according to a well-established pattern: gifts, demonstrations of power, recognition of formal vassalage, and the exchange of ambassadors. The first fortified outpost, Western Harbor, was established at the mouth of the Congo River. Unlike the Europeans, the Chinese were not yet interested in slaves. They were interested in ivory, gold, and rare woods. Rumors of giant ships coming from the south begin to spread up the coast, passing from tribe to tribe until they reach the advanced Portuguese trading posts in Mauritania. But the Europeans dismissed these stories as legends. What if the meeting of civilizations takes place right on Europe's doorstep? Imagine the middle of the 15th century, when the continent has not yet recovered from the plague, and states are fighting for power and trade. At this time, around 1445, the vanguard of the Chinese fleet, having passed the Canary Islands and encountered almost no resistance, entered European waters. Their route lay through areas where Europeans had only ever seen fishing boats and small merchant ships. The wind and ocean currents brought the Chinese to the mouth of the Tagus River, to Lisbon itself. Portugal, the only country in Europe at that time actively looking to the ocean and searching for sea routes to India, became the first to encounter the great maritime power of the East. The scene that unfolded in the Lisbon roadstead could have been the most surreal picture of the era, capable of overturning the understanding of the world. The huge 9-masted treasure ships of the Ming fleet, painted in bright colors and decorated with dragon figures, towered over the water like multi-story buildings, casting a shadow over the entire port. Their size is so incredible to Europeans that local sailors initially mistake them for floating fortresses or mythical monsters. Next to them, Portuguese caravels and barges look like fishing boats, like toy copies of real ships. Townspeople gather on the embankments, many crossing themselves in fear. In their travels, Europeans have never seen anything like this before. This is not an invasion, it is a visit. Although it feels like an earthquake in the political landscape of Europe, Chinese officials in silk robes with scrolls and seals disembark, expecting to meet local barbarian chiefs as they called anyone who did not recognize the Emperor of Heaven. For Christian Europe, this is a shock of cultural proportions. Many expected the appearance of the legendary presbyter John, a mythical ally from the East who was supposed to help in the fight against Islam. Instead, they saw a power whose might and grace did not fit into either biblical prophecies or political dreams. It was a meeting of worlds that knew almost nothing about each other. Diplomatic contact proved difficult and tense, as if two civilizations were speaking different languages, even when interpreters were present. The Chinese were accustomed to a system of tribute gifts, in which one side recognized the superiority of the other, and in return received protection and trade privileges. They do not trade on equal terms, because in their world there are simply no states equal to them. They demand that the King of Portugal perform the kowtow ritual, a bow to the ground before the decree of Emperor Ming, considering it a natural expression of respect. For the proud European monarchs, this is a humiliation that violates their conception of divine monarchy. But the cannons on the decks of the Byakuan ships, capable of reducing coastal forts to dust with a single volley, make them much more compliant. Lisbon and then Cadiz in Spain became entry points for Chinese goods, transforming into new gateways to the east. Silk, porcelain, and lacquerware, which previously reached Europe through dozens of middlemen along the Silk Road, were now unloaded directly at the port before prices fell, but trade volumes skyrocketed because demand grew faster than ships could unload. European artisans began to copy Chinese goods, but the quality was incomparable. Gradually, Europe realizes that it is not the center of the world, as it used to think, but its poor outskirts, dependent on the mercy of countries that possess far greater resources and knowledge. A rethinking of its own role in world history begins. In this chapter, we will depart from the chronology of events and analyze why this encounter was a technological knockout for 15th century Europe. The gap in maritime technology was fundamental. The basis of Chinese power was the design of the hull. European ships of that time were built on the principle of clinker or overlap construction, with a single internal volume. Any serious breach below the waterline meant certain death. Chinese junks in Baoshuan used a system of watertight bulkheads. The ship was divided into isolated compartments. If one compartment was flooded, the ship remained afloat. Europe would not adopt this standard until the 18th and 19th centuries. The second aspect was navigation and control. The Chinese used a balanced stern rudder with holes, fenestrated rudder, which made it easy to control a giant ship even in a storm. Europeans controlled ships using a colder stock, a primitive lever that limited maneuverability. The third factor was medicine and logistics. The Ming fleet was an autonomous system. Soybeans were sprouted on ships to provide the crew with vitamin C. Tea ceremonies in boiling water reduced the risk of intestinal infections. While European sailors died of scurvy and dysentery on long voyages, the Chinese fleet kept its crews fit for months. The military aspect was also on the side of the East. Although Europeans already knew about gunpowder, Chinese naval artillery was more standardized, and the use of powder rockets and incendiary shells gave them an advantage in long-range combat, allowing them to burn the enemy's sails before boarding. How might the course of history have changed if financial flows had been different? China's appearance in the Atlantic instantly changes Europe's economic motivation. In reality, Europeans were looking for a route to India for spices. In this scenario, the source of wealth came to them, but a balance of payments problem arose. The Chinese economy is self-sufficient. They do not need European wool, wine, or flax. China only accepts hard currency, silver and gold. 15th century Europe is poor in precious metals. In order to buy the coveted porcelain and silk, Europe urgently needs to find money. This triggered a frantic race, but not to the east, but to the west. Knowing the precise dimensions of the earth from Chinese astronomers and cartographers who exchanged knowledge with Europeans, European navigators realized that there must be more land somewhere. The search for gold became a matter of economic survival. The Spanish crown financed any crazy projects, including the expedition of the Genoese Christopher Columbus, with redoubled energy. Columbus's goal now is not India, which is already occupied or accessible through the Chinese, but the mythical islands of gold, in order to pay off his new trading partners. On the other hand, China is also beginning to take an interest in the origin of goods. Learning of potential lands across the ocean, the Ming admirals may send part of the fleet along the equatorial current from the coast of Africa. The winds there are favorable for the passage to Brazil. The presence of Chinese trading posts in Lisbon, Seville, and possibly even London has a profound and multifaceted impact on European society, which until then had little idea of what a powerful Eastern civilization looked like. The fashion for Orientalism began 3 centuries earlier than in our history, and it encompassed not only fashion, but also ways of thinking. The aristocracy tried to imitate the manners of Minskov officials, adopting their courteous bows, manner of conversation, and even style of dress. Merchants sought to establish ties with Chinese intermediaries, hoping to gain access to exclusive goods that became status symbols. Tea gradually became the drink of the elite as early as the 15th century, replacing ale and wine at banquets. This changed the culture of communication, habits, and even court ceremonies. In religious terms, a most interesting and completely unexpected process took place, which no one in Europe could have predicted. The Vatican was confronted with a civilization that was indifferent to Christian dogma, but at the same time possessed high morals and a strict system of ethics based on Confucianism. This became a challenge for the church hierarchy because they were not dealing with pagans, but with an educated society capable of philosophical dialogue. The Pope sent missions not to baptize savages, as had been done before, but to engage in theological debates with Chinese sages and study their worldview. Some monks began to translate Confucian texts in an effort to understand the logic of their philosophy. This opened up new directions in European thought. Technologies that were previously known only in general terms or did not exist at all penetrated Europe. Printing, which was already beginning to develop, rapidly improved under the influence of Chinese movable type and then reproduction methods. Paper production became higher quality and cheaper, and porcelain workshops began to appear in Italy and Spain, where craftsmen tried to replicate Chinese secrets. All this accelerated the Renaissance, adding new sources of inspiration and knowledge. Leonardo da Vinci, having seen drawings of Chinese machines and complex mechanisms, received a new impetus for his engineering research and began to expand his studies. Thus, the East became not just a trading partner, but a source of new ideas and technologies. But there is also a downside to this discovery of the world, which affects Europe just as deeply. Along with goods come diseases, although the effect is not as devastating as in America, because Eurasia has been a single epidemiological cauldron for centuries. These epidemics tend to intensify the circulation of familiar diseases rather than create new disasters. Much more important is the exchange of ideas, which changes the political structure of Europe. The Chinese meritocracy, based on a system of examinations for officials, fascinates European monarchs who dream of weakening the power of the hereditary feudal aristocracy. They see it as a tool for strengthening personal power and creating a more manageable state. The idea of a centralized bureaucratic state apparatus begins to take root in Europe earlier, forming absolutism in a more mature and rational form. Let us compare the known outcome with a possible alternative on the horizon of 5 centuries and imagine what the world could have been like with a different distribution of power. By the 20th century, humanity would have approached a completely different global balance where no single civilization dictates the rules, but several centers influence the course of history. The colonization of America would most likely have turned from a purely European enterprise into a joint process involving Eastern powers. Driven by a thirst for silver for trade with China and a desire to maintain their positions, Europeans would still have conquered Mexico and Peru, following historical logic. But China, using its base in West Africa and its long-range fleet, would develop the east coast of South America or the Caribbean, creating its own trading enclaves there. As a result, the two worlds would meet not only in the Atlantic, but also in the New World. In this scenario, the Pacific Ocean gradually turns into a Chinese lake, where trade routes, ports, and naval bases belong to the Celestial Empire. Australia, isolated before our story, would have been colonized by immigrants from Guangdong and Fujian long before James Cook's voyages, which would have changed the fate of the continent. Settlements established by Chinese navigators seeking new markets and resources appear on the west coast of North America. San Francisco is founded as the port of Golden Mountain, Jinshan, as early as the 16th century, becoming a key point in Pacific maritime trade. Local cultures come into contact with Chinese artisans, merchants, and officials, creating a unique blend of traditions. The Pacific region becomes a region where Eastern culture is primary, not borrowed. The Industrial Revolution could have started not in England, but in the rich and densely populated Yangtze Delta, where crafts and manufacturing were already highly developed. The global market created by the Chinese fleet would have created a huge demand for consumer goods that could not be met by traditional manual labor. Under these conditions, the manufactories of Suzhou and Hangzhou would have been forced to mechanize their processes earlier than the factories in Manchester. The steam engine could have been invented to pump water from Chinese mines or to drive looms, giving the East a technological advantage. The mechanization that began in China would spread throughout the Pacific region, attracting labor and capital. In such a world, Europe would play the role of a follower rather than a leader. English would not become the sole language of international communication and would not spread as widely as it did in real history. The world would be bilingual or even multilingual, with Chinese characters dominating trade, diplomacy, and science in the East and the Pacific region. Latin, or one of the major European languages, would continue to be used in the Atlantic, serving as a second global standard. Scientists, merchants, and navigators would have been forced to master both writing systems, which would have made international culture more diverse. Translators and linguists would have gained a special status, connecting East and West. As a result, global communication would have become broader but less homogeneous. Christianity would not have become the only world religion defining the spiritual map of the planet. It would have coexisted with the Neo-Confucian ethical code, which spread along with Chinese settlements, trade, and administration. Not only would conflicts arise between the two systems, but also serious dialogues influencing the moral norms of societies. Christian missions would have faced a competing moral tradition, which would have led to a more flexible and philosophical form of missionary activity. Globalization would have come earlier, but it would have been more balanced, without a period of complete European dictatorship and colonial humiliation of Asia. The world would have developed in a multipolar way, where no civilization would have gained an absolute advantage. The scenario we have considered shows how fragile the balance of power was in the 15th century. The decision to burn the fleet and destroy the archives taken in Beijing effectively gave Europe the keys to the planet. China voluntarily renounced its role as global architect, ceding it to peoples who at that time lagged behind it in every respect. If the treasuries had reached Europe, the great geographical discoveries would not have been a monologue of the West. It would have been a dialogue, albeit a tense one, between two great centers of power. The world would have become closer much earlier, and the exchange of knowledge and technology could have accelerated human progress by centuries. We live in a reality created by the absence of a Chinese fleet in the Atlantic, but alternative history reminds us that leadership is not only about resources and technology, but above all about the will and willingness to look beyond the horizon. Subscribe so you don't miss new versions of history.